Alright, now we're gonna go back in time. I want you to imagine yourself 4.5 million years ago. You are an early human, a member of a small tribe that has been wandering this scorched earth for weeks. The sun beats down around you. There isn't a cloud in the sky, not a single body of water anywhere is not a puddle left behind by the last rainfall months ago. Every one of them has turned into quicksand. Rivers are dry, cracked, and dangerous. They're patrolled by packs of wild dogs. At their watering holes, crocodiles wait to ambush anything stupid enough to take a drink. The soil underfoot is hard and cracked and doesn't conceal anything. Everyone and everything is visible from above. And if you get too close to the riverbed, well, there's bound to be a hippopotamus resting there. Giant hippos that can weigh over 9 tons and have 40-inch jaws. Good luck outrunning those when they decide to charge. This environment is alien to us today because most of the world is wet. But life 4.5 million years ago was very different. This is a story about a time before rain, a time before oceans, a time when water was worth more than fire, food, or shelter, when every drop meant survival and every river meant war. Chapter 1. The Drought. Today our planet is covered in water. But what would happen if the Earth suddenly had no liquid water? What would happen if all the water on the planet evaporated overnight? If that were to happen, we would not survive a week without dying of dehydration. In fact, even just 2 days without drinking water can kill you. In the worst-case scenario, you can live up to 7 days without food, but you cannot live more than 3 without water. That's why in a drought, people lose their minds much faster than they lose weight. Your body can survive a lot, but once it starts losing its fluids, it can't keep going for long. This means that in the history of mankind, droughts could wipe out whole species. 4.5 million years ago, the climate shifted and it did so quickly. Until then, Earth was a warm place. Our earliest ancestors had always lived in warm climates. But in the blink of an eye, the entire planet went through a mini ice age. It started raining less and less, and whenever it rained, it was cold. This meant that the water froze immediately. It may have seemed like a blessing at first, but soon all the animals realized that this new ice threatened their survival. All the water turned into solid blocks. Soon the ground was frozen and all the little streams and lakes became ice rinks. As the seasons passed, the ice got thicker and thicker, turning into enormous glaciers filled with hundreds of feet of ice. This affected the rest of the planet as well. Hot spots dried up and turned into deserts. Lush jungles became golden grasslands. And along with the drought, a flood of changes swept across the planet. Small tribes of early humans roamed these dry lands. Their settlements were not places per se, more like temporary camps. Some were bigger, others smaller, and each day they walked miles in search of water. These ancient humans were small and fragile, but they had something huge, their minds. They were also extremely curious and loved to explore new territories. Each day they would walk out into the plains until they found a muddy pond. And that's where they stayed for the rest of the day, drinking, bathing, and getting their fill. But they knew that the next morning they would have to start again. So at night, while sitting around the fire, they told stories about the next day's journey and made plans together. But every time they walked to a river, they had to worry about being attacked. Once there, they had to contend with giant crocodiles, packs of hungry hyenas, or giant anteaters. They also had to watch out for other human tribes. For our tiny ancestors, life was a challenge every single day. They had to contend with droughts, predators, rival groups, and other dangers. Yet despite all this, they survived. But they didn't do it alone. The secret was to stay united. Even though the land was dry, they weren't. Chapter 2. First, territorial conflicts. Throughout history, we humans have done terrible things to defend our borders. We've waged massive wars, committed atrocities, and even killed each other's children just to hold on to our territory. But throughout history, defending our borders has always been essential. Without a doubt, this instinct comes to us from our ancestors. Those poor ancient men already understood that if they couldn't defend their land, they wouldn't survive. So when the drought hit, they started setting boundaries, and the first of these were set around the rivers. At first, these boundaries were nothing official. They were more like paths that led to the river and back. But over time, these paths were defended by the strongest members of the tribe, and that's how the first conflicts began. Over time, these defenders built primitive weapons and formed small groups to defend their river. After all, if they lost access to water, everyone would die. Soon, the word got out. Other groups that wanted to use the river had to pay a price, either in food, women, or gold. It didn't matter what they paid, but if they didn't bring something to the table, they would have to face the defenders. It sounds crazy, but this was the first war in history, and it was all about water. Now, don't get me wrong, there had been fights before, but this was different. It was no longer about killing a rival or taking his woman. It was about sending a message that this water belonged to someone else. Other groups could come and drink, but only if they brought something in exchange, and those who refused would face the consequences. With the river came power, and those who had it knew it. Chapter 3. Water and Survival. Despite the violence that erupted around the rivers, life went on, and the survivors continued to roam the thirsty lands, searching for a way to stay alive. They noticed that sometimes, early in the morning, there was a bit of water left over in the plants. Specifically, the leaves of certain plants would collect tiny drops of dew. So they would get up before the sun and pluck the leaves off the plants, squeezing them in their hands to collect the water inside. In addition, they discovered that if they dug a few feet into the ground, they could find dry earth. And in some cases, if they dug deep enough, they could find flowing underground rivers. Of course, this water was not as plentiful as the great rivers, but it was enough to save lives. So the tribes would dig a shallow well and bring up buckets of fresh water. Sometimes it was muddy, sometimes it wasn't, but they were happy to have it. This way they didn't have to move from place to place every day, and they could live in one place for many months. They also learned another lesson about water. They noticed that when one of their own needed water, they had to give it to them first. The children were the ones who suffered the most from the drought. They were constantly thirsty, but they couldn't carry large buckets of water. So the adults always gave them water first. And if a child died of thirst, the entire family would be affected. So they had to protect the most vulnerable at all costs. This is how the first concept of family came about. If you think all this sounds familiar, that's because our story is not unique. It happened to our ancestors, but it's also been repeated countless times throughout history. Anytime a region experiences a drought, the same thing happens. People unite to survive, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Families join forces. Rivalries are forgotten, and no one dares leave the village unless it's absolutely necessary. Even today, the same thing happens to us. When there's no water, people go crazy. Chapter 4. Animals vs. Humans. But our ancestors weren't the only ones suffering from the drought. The animals were as well. In fact, they suffered even more since they couldn't understand what was happening. At night, hyenas would attack the watering holes. They were looking for food, and they were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. They would sneak up on the watering hole and pick off the slowest prey, especially the elderly. Meanwhile, crocodiles lurked beneath the surface waiting for their turn. They attacked anyone who got too close. It was a true horror show. No wonder our ancestors preferred to stay away from the rivers at night. But early man was smarter than the animals. He knew when to approach the river and when to stay away. He knew that he wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he had a weapon the animals didn't have: intelligence. The fight for water shaped the destiny of humankind. It wasn't just thirst they fought against, it was extinction. Thanks for watching. See you next time.